Well, thank you for having me here. A number of old friends that it's great to see again, and meeting new people as well. I'd like to pay very brief honor to Bob Kiter. This has been an outstanding gathering and an emotional one, and it's consistent with the work of the Stegner Center over the years. It's really a gift from the center and the law school and the university to the larger community here in Salt Lake and Utah and the West generally. The publications, the films, the conferences over the year have been absolutely outstanding, and there are many reasons for that, but right at the top you'd have to rank Bob's commitment and intellectual and personal depth. I first came west in 1963 to go to law school at Stanford. For a while, like many before me, I didn't much relate to the land of California, dry and brown, no autumn, no spring. Then, after my second year, I went down to the Southwest to clerk for a law firm, Lewis and Roca. It was in Phoenix, at the tail end of the time when you could still argue over whether Phoenix was a large town or a small city. Paul Roca, one of the senior partners, took me under his wing. Paul, a surpassingly great lawyer, was of Chilean, Spanish, and Mexican blood from settlers who started out in Sonora, Mexico, and moved up to Tucson in early statehood days. Paul loved the Arizona-Sonora borderland with all his heart. He gave me so much time, lunch, dinner, late evening, especially the late evenings. Widely read, he told me in segments about the history of the Southwest, the copper strikes, the mountain man Ewing Young, Brigham Young, the Apaches, the Padres. The latter and the land they settled were his deepest passion. A high Episcopalian, he saw magic and eternity in the lives and expeditions of these Catholic pioneers as they made their settlements and dreams in rugged, remote desert country. He had gotten into the backcountry of the state of Sonora, crossed the line from Arizona, ever since college, but by the late 1940s, he'd institutionalized his expeditions. At least once a year, sometimes twice, he would take jeep trips, 10 days or more, into the bracing, clear air of the interior, searching for 17th and 18th century missions, or what was left of them, places that had been lost to memory. These trips were exhilarating, and it wasn't just the missions and the fact that Paul loved loud, lingering late-night arguments, especially about history. You see, in addition, the standard recipe for a Toro Bravo is 1 part tequila and 3 parts Kahlua. But Paul, considering it a matter of principle, prided himself in reversing the proportions of the ingredients. In 1967, he published a wonder of a book, Paths of the Padres Through Sonora. He cataloged all of his travels and his sources, maps, journals, letters, diaries, Bibles, conversations with locals, whatever he could track down, that led to 134 missions, some still in use, others not holding church but fully standing, still others reduced to walls or foundations or consisting of scattered stones among the mesquite, ironwood, and patches of bunch grass. He photographed them all in precise black and white. About half of these missions were vaguely known to have once existed. but there were no other photographs. They were considered rediscovered by Paul. For a couple of dozen, everyone, historians, church officials, nearby campesinos, was disbelieving that such churches ever existed until they had the chance to read Paul's historical documentation and photographs. Then he spent more years in backcountry Chihuahua, the Mexican state to the east of Sonora, uncovering the Padres' paths there and giving us back still more history. Charlie, if you want to be a good lawyer in Phoenix, you have to know the history and land of Arizona. That didn't fully register with me, but I decided to do it on faith, and besides, it sounded like fun. For my education, Paul finagled me onto a case that required me to examine old litigation files in the courthouse in Prescott, the first territorial capital. Taking his cues, I stomped around the ghost town of Jerome and Bisbee, the site of the Wobblies' 1917 strike against the Phelps Dodge Copper Queen mine. To hike and fish, I ventured to many canyons and streams, among them Tonto, Havasupai, and the white and black on the White Mountain Reservation in the high country to the east. Charlie, you ought to see Caborica. I went down to that striking Sonoran mission 2 hours south of the line. It must be obvious the debt I have to Paul, how much I learned from him. But there are two other things, hard lessons. Paul repeatedly invited me to accompany him on his Jeep trips, and I yearned to go. But young lawyer that I was always too busy. Then in 1979, his daughter, Mariana, and my dear friend called. "Oh, Charlie, Daddy just died. It was a heart attack." She said the family would like for me to be a pallbearer in the tall cathedral where many hundreds would gather. A young scholar, I was too busy. To this day, those decisions make me wince. I'm limited. We all are. But I now try to be a whole lot more dedicated to getting out on the land, committing to special times with family and friends, and honoring the people who have enriched my life. Spurred on by Paul, who made book lists for me, for about 2 decades, I went on a manic, out-of-control reading tangent about the West. History, literature, biography, policy, sometimes science, even law, you name it. Many, many hundreds of books. It was positively embarrassing. It's nice, by the way, to be in company where many others have been similarly outrageous. When I moved to San Francisco in '68, I was blown away by the cornucopia of California history. Upon joining the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, I dove into the Rockies, Great Plains, and Indians. Upon joining the law faculty at Oregon in '75, the Northwest captivated me. I'm so glad I did it. I'm so glad it's over. The burden of Western history, to me, that came to have a totally different meaning. The exquisitely painful guilt imposed by the dour, glowering insistence of 2 hip-high stacks of unread books. They're gone, shelved unread. I'm free, more or less. When I started teaching law, I realized early on that all the court cases and statutes and administrative rules and economic analysis, which was all the rage, were so pallid, they left out so much. Finally, getting Paul's point, I realized that I could not accurately and fully teach what I'd come to call the law of the American West: public lands, Indian tribes, water, mining, grazing, endangered species, without incorporating both literature and on-the-ground expeditions to see the places. It isn't always easy to fit that into the curriculum, but in our teaching we ought to always be clear on what is optimum. Shouldn't a student studying oil and gas leasing in the Lewis and Clark National Forest along the Rocky Mountain front have read some Doig and Kittredge and visited that place in Montana, which after all isn't exactly tough duty? To grasp the enormity and the tone and texture of the General Allotment Act of 1887, which expropriated 100 million acres of Indian land, shouldn't a person read Vine Deloria Jr. and Linda Hogan and visit some allotted reservations? To understand wilderness designation in southern Utah, don't you need to hike down into the wild canyons that drape off of Cedar Mesa and visit the ancient Puebloans? To comprehend Western water law, possibly the stupidest body of law we've ever created, don't we have to digest Powell, Stegner, Terry Tempest Williams, and Milagro Beanfield War and visit the junction of the Salt and Verde? I mention those two rivers for this reason. When I lived in Phoenix, and of course it's true today, the Salt River was dead dry through the city. Everybody knew it. People chuckled about it. Some scratched their heads and found it interesting. That dry riverbed stuck in my mind after I moved away. I'd fished and loved many of the tributaries that ran in the White Mountains and below the Mogollon Rim and into the Salton Verde. That water gone. Then I started teaching water law and learned that Granite Reef Diversion Dam a few miles upriver east of that desert town diverted the entire flow of the Salt River for irrigation and electricity. The next time I was in the area, I went still further east of town, upriver from the diversion, to the Y, where the Salt and Verde join. These were full-bodied, erotic rivers, filling the air with river smells and creating with their overflows a low forest of willows and mesquite and ocotillo. Living rivers, but not for long. Within an hour, the water I was watching at the Y would become a commodity. Water no more. That was the moment the immensity of Western water development and all of its insults to rivers hit me. Later, I would learn the reasons for that dry river and all the others, not from laws and court cases and reports of engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation, but from Powell, Stegner, Williams, and Nichols. I know what you're thinking. I've left out a bard, and you're right. I also learned a hell of a lot about Western water from Edward Paul Abbey. My personal gratitude to Western writers led me to action of sort as I alluded more and more often to why we need literature to understand the law of the American West. Students and others asked me for suggested readings. I compiled various lists and finally said, what the hell? I wrote a law review article the length of a short book for the Michigan Law Review and then published it as a short book in '87 with the University of Colorado Press. The title was The Law of the American West, a critical bibliography of the non-legal sources. And I dedicated it to Wally Stegner, who, quote, has depicted the American West in its truest hues. The point of the book, which discussed very briefly, of course, some 400 books, was the point Paul had instilled in me. We can't understand the West without learning about it from the literature of the West. Let me be clear about why I wrote that book, about why I write pretty much every word I publish. I care passionately and deeply about the American West and its land, using Leopold's definition that includes water, animals, and vegetation, and its communities. Good writing can shape people's attitudes. Attitudes make laws. Law influences what happens to the West. There can be a straight shot from writing to attitudes about law to what happens to the land and the communities. The words of Western writers, Stegner foremost, have power. The words of Western writers, Stegner foremost, have helped Westerners understand our successes and our difficulties and failures, to understand what we have and what we have to lose. Fairly late in my reading rampage, I crossed a personal divide. Having grown up back east, which wasn't my fault, I was self-conscious about being a Westerner. In '82, I went to one of the terrific conferences put on by the Institute of the American West for several summers in Ketchum and Sun Valley. During an intense roundtable discussion, I began a sentence with "we." No one else thought a whit about it, I'm sure. It was just a pronoun. But I took my own meaning from my inadvertent use of it. Yes, 19 years after crossing the 100th meridian on my way to law school, I was finally comfortable enough to say that I am a Westerner. I had thought a whole lot about what we had to gain and lose. I was optimistic about the West then in the early '80s, with its surging pride. It was no longer a backwater, and the bevy of laws to protect the land. But to my lasting sadness, the optimism was naive and ill-placed. In terms of net gains for the land, the surging pride mattered, and so did the Western writers and the laws. But the boomers and boosters won out by preserving for still a few more generations the momentum generated by the out-of-control, rugged individualism and the blockhead certainty that we can build anything and that we can build our way out of anything. An honors student I'm working with called it the utter vulnerability of the West. So I'm optimistic about some things in the West, but not optimistic about the West broadly writ. I'm not broadly pessimistic either. I'm just waiting to see what a new generation can do. That brings us to the title of my talk, The Fourth West. The idea came to me just recently. A quick Google search indicates that it may not have been used this way before. In fact, the most common use of the term Fourth West had to do with a recent report of a Fourth West Nile disease epidemic. These thoughts about a Fourth West, new to me, are not a pronouncement only floating an idea for you to consider. I'll mostly address the land. The West has many other pressing problems. But in the past and now, the way in which Westerners have tried, failed, and succeeded to find right relationships with the land have always been at the core by what we mean by the West. The first West was when only Native Americans lived here. And though there are ambiguities on this point, the early communities that were settled when the Padres kept moving north after establishing Paul Roca's missions in the Southland. The Hispanics were different from and later than the Indians but they were land-based communities also. The Second West began with John Marshall's gold find and the extraordinary array of events that it triggered over the course of a century. The Third West began with the end of World War II. At the outset of this Third West, as I've mentioned, the debate was whether Phoenix was a large town or a small city. A blink of time later, the question is whether the Valley of the Sun is a metropolis or a megalopolis. Maybe we are about to enter a Fourth West. There are some trends which I'll return to that may suggest such a thing. The premise for a Fourth West is that we finally do know what we have and what we have to lose. Since part of that has to do with community, increasing use of collaboration is a logical development. The words that I'm about to read are ones you know, and as I expected, are ones that have already been read, in this case by Patty Limerick. But returning to the classics is permissible in polite company, and for me, these are the best words ever written about the West. They're Stegner's, written in the Third West, mostly characterizing the Second West, but addressing the Third also, and more than any other words, imagining what the Fourth West might be if one is to be. The West is the native home of hope. When it finally learns that cooperation, not rugged individualism, is the pattern that most characterizes it and preserves it, then it will have achieved itself and outlived its origins. Then it has a chance to create a society to match the scenery. Doing this would require us to gain a deeper understanding about our relationship to the natural world. Western writers have done a good job of articulating the beauty of the land and its economic significance and social significance, but less well at addressing the importance of land to our humanity, at identifying how central the intellectual, psychological, and emotional need for land is to Western societies and how fierce that need is. In the Third West, as in the Second, the land is a commodity and an amenity. Why have we not challenged that construct more? It may be that we worry about being soft, romantic. A serious society is premised on great ideas, not great landscapes. But serious societies are also premised on music, art, and literature. It seems to me, in the Third West, we still hold back from announcing that our connection to the land is of the same rank as the great arts. We fear that this relationship to the land may be too fluffy, too unintellectual to belong in such company. We're reluctant to ask daring questions. In the West, how does the importance of our ties to the land compare with freedom of speech, with freedom of religion? We can imagine fighting and fighting hard in our own ways against restrictions on religion and speech. How do we assess those commitments with assaults on canyons or rivers or forests or animals? Maybe the other values do rank higher, but in the Third West, we haven't much asked those kinds of questions, debated them, or consider them worthy in a discussion of great ideas. If we're going to build societies to match the scenery, we need to be clear about the place of the scenery in those societies. Perhaps the most distinctive right that Westerners possess is the fact of the federal public lands, rising behind us here and spread out on the horizon below, found all across the 11 western states, and a full 50% of all land between the Rockies and the Sierra and Cascades. The public lands are close in for most of us, never more than an hour away. There's so much open space, so much variety, so much wildness. There are people now, while there are more people now, at the same time, through our daring in passing the Great Wilderness Act of 1964, and thanks to Bruce Babbitt's vision, bringing back the wolves and the condors and others and protecting the great bear, we have at times made profound stands in the name of wildness. In a discussion about family, Wally Stegner told me how he adopted the practice of sometimes taking Paige with him on his research trips. That resonated with me, and I began doing it. Also, I realized that it helped mend an ache by seeing that my boys would have backcountry times that I had denied myself through my short-sightedness with Paul Roca's invitations. So many times with my boys. One that comes to mind was when Seth was 20 and he and I took a long home from college trip to the canyon country. We hiked most of one day with water up to our calves in a creek that over the course of some 7 million years had cut down 1,000 feet through the fiery Wingate sandstone and the layers of rock above it. We had our own wild place, suffused with languid, slow time and pleasurable, hard work. Then, in a rare wide spot in the canyon, behind a cluster of junipers, we found a panel of pictographs. The artisan painted this row of red and white images, supernatural and life-size, with broad shoulders, narrow waists. We could see straight through the round, staring eyes, and they could see through us. It demeans these and hundreds upon hundreds of other public lands ventures, some with my boys, some with Ann and friends, some alone, some short, some long, some close, some far, to describe them as memories or amenities. No, they are my prized possessions, as real and tangible as my best books or my carved canoe panel from the Quinaults. They are inlaid parts of myself, my humanity. And you know that I am not alone in this. Will there be a fourth West? If so, the recent elections may be cited as a beginning point only partly because of what the new administration may do in terms of laws and policies, but perhaps more important because of what the new administration may inspire in others, and how the elevation of this administration and other recent electoral decisions may reflect what Westerners are ready for. There are some things that we know will happen. It is their scale, which we can't predict, that will determine whether they lead to a new era, making the Third West clearly a transition between the second and a new fourth. We know that the new administration will be dramatically more conservation-oriented than the last. At a minimum, we will return to the long, steady, upward conservationist trend that prevailed. Yes, even Jim Watt didn't stem that trend. From, say, the passage of the Wilderness Act up through 2001, when the most environmentally destructive administration in history began its work. We know that science, rather than being ignored or perverted, will again be an important tool, basically a measuring stick, for federal policy. We know that climate change will finally be acknowledged and addressed. We know also that decision-making will be more open to the public, more collaborative. That will all happen, but we don't know how robust those developments will be. We don't know whether those federal changes will have a multiplier effect and create chain reactions, dovetailing with complementary actions by Western states, which, after all, as a group, have been more progressive environmentally by far than the national government in this century. And the greatest potential of all, inspiring and activating Westerners, especially young people, to act in the name of the land. Take climate change. The impact of a robust climate change policy will radiate out through society. We hear talk of green jobs, but that phrase didn't exist 5 years ago. It's a new phenomenon, and it's not likely to be a fad. It can bring great numbers of people into environmental jobs. If we are serious about addressing climate change, it will have an enormous healing effect on the environment generally. Fix or alleviate climate change, and you fix or improve the health of air, land, rivers, and oceans the world over. And the young people. There are signs that climate change could be the cause of a generation. True, there is sadness in the environmental state of the earth. But sadness comes with every cause, because causes only exist when there are wrongs to be corrected. A person shouldn't live a life without a cause. Curing global warming is complicated in the extreme, beyond our comprehension, really. But what you do is work on part of it, and there are parts of it for any job or profession you can name, from construction to ecology to poetry. What a terrible time to be young. What a wonderful time to be young. By the year 2000, we'd reached a rough consensus that decisions on high by experts was not the best way to restore the lands and the rivers. There needed to be no more collaboration at the community level with all affected parties represented. The best approach was to have federal standards, sideboards, and local implementation. The past several years broke from that consensus by wrecking the sideboards and imposing top-down decisions. At the federal level, we will return, again without knowing the scale, to the rough consensus that emerged over the previous two generations. While the Western states have moved impressively on collaboration, given the facts of so much public land and the broad sweep of the Endangered Species and Clean Water Acts, no watershed in the 11 western states can be restored without deep federal participation. With more action nationally, watershed restoration is a main arena where new people can be drawn into environmental restoration, especially with federal leadership that puts forth progressive approaches and inspires Westerners. Watersheds aren't generic. Each has its own opportunities and limitations depending upon topography, flow regime, allocation of water rights, urban and rural development patterns, and mix of public and federal lands. Since every watershed is distinctive, local knowledge and cooperation help create real progress, depending on personalities and determination, because these efforts are often time-consuming. We've seen a lot of collaborative efforts in the past 2 decades or so on Western watersheds, large and small, with successes, failures, and results in between. Rather than being pie in the sky, the movement toward collaboration, this is the central impulse of Steve Trimble's tough-minded book, Bargaining for Eden. Watershed collaboration seems to be growing and maturing. It's happening simply because collaboration holds out such promise when all the many variables line up. A place to watch is Northwest Washington, including Puget Sound and the Olympic Peninsula. To me, while the area has plenty of problems, this is the highly populated western place that comes closest to having the kind of relationship with the natural world that I hope we will see in a fourth West. Northwesterners are open and forthright in revering their green surroundings and see the land as an integral part of their lives. Washington was one of the first states to develop programs to combat global warming. The sacred movement to save the salmon, an excruciatingly difficult undertaking, is a far-flung and expensive enterprise bringing together the state, tribes, cities, counties, federal offices, and environmental groups. Individual citizens pitch in. Lawn signs declaring salmon-friendly lawn are sprouting up, signaling that no toxic fertilizers, herbicides, or pesticides have been put on that lawn. These citizens know that chemical flows into Puget Sound through storm sewers are killers. Puget Sound is such a glorious sheet of water, broad, blue, serene, like the ocean, which we've for so long seen as inexhaustible. The Sound can seem indestructible in its perfection. But most of the public in Northwest Washington looked beneath the surface as reports came in of beached whales and dead zones uninhabitable by oysters, geoducks, and other shellfish. Polluted habitat in the Sound is one of the reasons why the Chinook have been listed, and the overriding cause for listing the elegant black and white orcas, the most contaminated marine mammals in the world. 2 years ago, the state legislature committed $1.6 billion to clean up Puget Sound, with almost half already spent. The main impulse is collaboration on a grand scale. The lead organization is the Puget Sound Partnership, and the main idea is to bring industry and citizens into compliance through funded local efforts. When you talk with people involved in the Puget Sound collaboration and the many other restoration efforts in the area, They will often roll their eyes and groan, "All I ever do is go to meetings." But they're proud. They know that it's the best way, that cooperation, not rugged individualism, is the pattern that most characterizes and preserves the landscapes of the West. A key part of these restoration efforts in the Northwest has been the flowering of the tribal presence, a phenomenon taking hold in many parts of the West. The 23 tribes in Northwest Washington have as many fisheries biologists working on salmon restoration as either the federal government or the state of Washington. Co-management by the federal government, the state, and the tribes is a day-to-day cooperative working reality. The tribes' many actions, policy-wise and scientific, collaborative and adversary, have been indispensable to the Pacific salmon recovery movement. Further, the tribal voice, authentic and heard regularly by the whole citizenry, helps set a moral tone for a moral cause. Indian people believe that they're part of the natural world. There's no dualism and everything is connected. They don't worship the natural world. They have their own gods, but they have sacred sites for worship and depend on the land and its renewal for sustenance. Forced assimilation has made its mark on Indian societies, but the old ways had too much worth to be abandoned. The worldview of the first West, practical, spiritual, biocentric, and ecological, lives on. We may hope that this way of thinking will be influential in the Fourth West. I don't mean, of course, that we non-Indians should somehow become members of tribal religions, only that American Indian views about the land should be part of the formal education and public discourse in the way that Leopold, Muir, Stegner, and others are read and discussed. Billy Frank Jr., a Nisqually Indian, is an example. Billy has led a remarkable life, first as an activist fighting to uphold the Indian treaties in the salmon wars of the 60s and 70s, and now one of the principal leaders and peacemakers in the Northwest restoration effort. For example, he's one of 7 civic leaders named by Governor Gregoire to the Leadership Council of the Puget Sound Partnership. I had the pleasure, what an understatement, of writing a short book about Billy, during which time I had some 60 hours of interviews with him. Once, talking about the 3- and 4-foot anthills that he used to watch as a boy under the fir trees in the Nisqually River watershed, but now are much less common due to the clear cutting. He said this: "We talk about state sovereignty and tribal sovereignty, but those ant communities are sovereign too. We've got to find a way to protect their sovereignty." On another occasion, he took it a step further. "It used to be, when I was a little boy, that you could see the stars at night. Now it's much harder to see them with all the lights from all the cities and towns. Those stars are sovereign. They have a right to be seen." Then, when he was in a reflective mood, I heard him saying these words: "I don't believe in magic. I believe in the sun and the stars, the water, the tides, the owls, the hawks flying, the river running, the wind talking. Their measurements, they tell us how healthy things are, how healthy we are, because we and they are the same. That's what I believe in. Finish up. Of course, I don't know whether there will be a fourth West or whether it will have the characteristics I've imagined here. I do believe that we need one and grieve that we may not see it. But I hope we grasp this moment. There are multitudes of ways to pitch in, each in our own fashion. Trust that your work matters. There is a lot at stake. This sacred land cuts to the mind and the heart and the soul, and none of them is an amenity. Thank you very much.
Yes, this might be a daring question without a short answer, but I'm wondering if you have any guidance as to how the public lands conserve clean energy, like solar and wind, without losing what's sacred about those lands.
That takes a very long answer, and I have only a short time. It ends up being a discussion of specifics. We need, and I think we are going to be doing this, and I don't know what the time spans are, but we need to set a time when we will reduce our carbon consumption, and by how much? A percentage in a year. The Secretary recently has put on hold, as you know, a large number of timber sales here and offshore. And so there needs to be a gradual lessening of new mineral leases. And then, because wind has obvious disadvantages, just in terms of unsightliness and sometimes impacts to birds, you want to find the right places to put them, and you want to find the right places to create solar, and those are site-by-site decisions. And the other thing we need to do, and I know this is obvious, but when you think about it, this is not enough a part of the debate we need to conserve. The amount of water and electricity we can conserve is unbelievable. I want to give one example, since I was mentioning the Northwest. The city of Seattle was consuming a certain amount of water, billions of gallons a year in 1974, gross. By the year 2000, the city of Seattle had brought its consumption down to the same gross figure as 1974, so that they now were at the same level. Then, during this decade, they pledged to reduce their gross consumption of water by another 1% a year, and they have already reached that total 10% without having to go through the full decade. And we can do that with energy, we can do it with water, and so that's a big part of the answer to your question. Okay, one more.
Isn't there an international element in developing a fourth West? If we do, won't there just be a great flood in this small world we live in now? And we're back into the same situation we are now, growth, almost unlimited growth.
I'm sorry, I want to be clear. Are you talking about population growth?
Certainly that's an element, yeah, in the whole international scene, yep.
I want to say briefly, because both questions are very fair, and they are, though complicated, they just are. But I want to say, first of all, that what you say is right, that now, certainly many environmental natural resource problems have international dimensions. And when I say that there are jobs and opportunities for young people, that's a prime example of what I mean. And I mean, isn't it amazing how this young generation has become so international? And it's, I think, really, really exciting. And there's more travel. One of my boys' sons last summer, after his second year in law school, went over to Cambodia to work on human rights. And many of you have family members who have done that. And all of that applies in the international. So there's really a lot of work to be available.
Thank you once again. Thank you so much.